Hello! Everybody knows the famed British redcoat. Everybody knows the powerful medieval knight. Civilizations rise and fall with one famous kind of soldier, and Rome is no exception. They were able to conquer the Mediterranean world using their unstoppable waves of men that they threw at any enemy. But Rome didn't use just one or just massive amounts of manpower. Their troops were also extremely well trained and deadly. But the bold image of legionnaires, always serving the Senate and the people of Rome, is false. Time and time again, Rome reinvented their army, destroying what stood in their way to preserve the state. The first soldiers were incredibly simplistic, and even the untrained Germanic mercenaries at the fall of the empire would scoff. But Rome evolved into having the best soldiers the classical world ever saw, something they proved by conquering the entire classical world. Rome, according to tradition, was founded in 753 BCE, or by Roman standards, 1 AUC. The first Roman soldiers could not even be considered soldiers. In fact, warriors would be a better term. They evolved out of farmers to fight local menaces, wolves, lions, and even small bands of enemies. They did become soldiers after a little bit of time, but were poorly trained and were nothing like the famous war machine that would come later. The point of this army was not to conquer and hold land, but more to raid and take needed resources back to Rome, as well as to defend the small city. The armies were made from various bands and were not a united force. The soldiers who could afford to had simple armor, sheets of bronze strapped to their fronts and occasionally backs, and what were essentially pots on their heads. The pot helmet was quite common in all of Italy this time, being easy to produce and quite protective. These soldiers were armed with the most common weapon in history, the cheap, easy-to-use spear. This army was not salaried or standing, but instead was based on the levy, conscription out of the populace for a short, specified amount of time. As time went on, the influence of the Greek colonies to the south and the Etruscans to the north had the army looking more and more like hoplites. The sheet armor became muscle cuirasses. The pot helmets now had more parts to them, ones that protected the side of the head and the face. They also had shields at times, although these were more common in the next phase of Roman war. After 4 Roman-born and bred kings had come and gone, Rome was ruled by a succession of 3 Etruscan kings. Etruria was this land near Rome, and the Etruscans had been the power and culture of central Italy for hundreds of years. They had their own military structure that they, as the overlords of Rome, imposed upon the fledgling city-state. The first king to reform the army was Servius Tullius, the second Etruscan king. The first reform he made was the resizing of the army into 4 groups known as legions, though these were not quite yet the famed legions that conquered and held Europe. The legions were assigned by lot, and any man from ages 16 to 46 was placed in the lottery to serve. Servius Tullius' second reform was to divide the army into 5 classes. Each of these had different roles. The first class, the wealthy, were the ones that could afford to have a cuirass, greaves, a shield, a sword, and a spear. These Class 1 soldiers closely mimicked Greek hoplites in terms of arms and strategy. The second class had greaves, a shield, a sword, and a spear. The third class could only afford to have the shield, a sword, and a spear. The fourth class was even simpler, just a shield and a spear. The fifth class would only be slingers. Here you can see the fourth class and the third class with helmets and swords for the fourth, and just a spear and shield for the fourth. The strategy of these armies was very simple. The Greek Phalanx. This was a strategy that involved solid masses of men lining up at one another and marching, using the spear to jab at enemies. If any one soldier fell, the one behind him would step up and take his place, continuing the fight. Cavalry was rare at this time, being only made up of the wealthy non-patricians known as the equites, an incredibly small social class that eventually grew. The phalanx worked better when you had Class 1 soldiers like this, heavily armored. The problem was they had to pay for all this out of their own pocket, which was very, very expensive. Now, the phalanx worked well in flatlands or narrow passes, but not well in the hills and mountains that fill the spine of Italy. The Romans realized their failures after their spectacular defeat at the Battle of Allia River in 390 BCE by the Senones and a seasoned general named Brennus. In fact, what happened was this general of the Romans named Marcus Furius Camillus routed the Senones. He then set about fixing the army so that a disaster like this could never occur again. He began the Manipular Legion. It consisted of checkerboarded lines of maniples, which were groups of about 40 to 60 men. There were 5 classes based on wealth, which were coming from the 5 Etruscan classes: the Rorai, the Hastati, the Principes, and the Leves. The way battles were waged was based on this. The Leves would skirmish as the Hastati attacked. The Leves were, of course, slingers, and the Hastati were the light forces. If this failed, then the Principi would send in. If this failed, then the Triarii would come in. The Rorai, which were a very poor mass of soldiers, were just used for sheer numbers and body mass at the end of a battle, if necessary. This strategy gave way to the saying, rem ad triarios redisse, or, quote, it has come to the Triarii, signaling that all else had failed. The Leves were light skirmishers, being the poorest. They had javelins and the occasional helmet or scudum, or just wore a skin of an animal like a tiger. Groups of about 20 of these were attached to every 60 Hastati. The Rorai, as mentioned, were the poor. They were armed with spears, a scudum, and helmets. The Hastati made up the main force of the army. They were not too wealthy or too poor, and they were armed with feathered helmets, a scudum, small chest plates, and a spear, as well as the occasional sword. Here you can see a skirmisher and a triarii. Now, the third group was the wealthy Principes, which was armed with chainmail called the Lorca Hamada, a feathered helm, a spear, and a scudum. There were roughly 900 of these, forming 15 maniples. The Triarii were essentially the Class 1 Etrusco-Roman hoplite, armed the same, armored the same, except for the growing popularity of chainmail over the incredibly restrictive solid metal cuirass. These were the very wealthy, as reflected by the fact that they fought last in order to save their own lives and their armor. In the interesting thing about this Principes is in his helmet you can see the influence of the Etruscan Greek design, which only served a stylistic purpose in his helmet. Cavalry was used as a flanking force, and they were armed and armored the same as the Princeps. Now, as the threat of Carthage approached Rome, the army was changed yet again, though this time to a lesser degree. These classes were no longer based on wealth, but experience in the army and age. The Rorai were disbanded, and the Leves were turned into Velites. The Velites were attached to any other melee class, and were scouts and skirmishers. The Hastati now numbered 1,200 in 10 maniples of 120 men each, and now bore swords instead of spears, as well as their old equipment. They were the inexperienced youth, as well as the first men in line. The Principes were the men in their prime, having served for years, but not being so old it hurt them. They were armed with mail and feathered helms, as well as the scutum and the sword, called the gladius. The numbers were increased to 1,200 in 12 maniples, just like the Hastati. The Triarii were the oldest veterans in the third line of defense. They were armored very similarly to the Principes, with mail or occasionally plate armor, a feathered helm, and a scutum. The major difference between the two was the fact that the Triarii had spears, not the more popular sword, as it would be easier to use at their more advanced age. The order of battle, just like in the Camillan system, was almost always followed. Notable exceptions, like Zama, existed, but they were few and far between and were only based on necessity. The only group that had almost no change were cavalry. They were the same, only flanking force. The army itself had suffered some bad defeats and some glorious victories when Gaius Marius rose to power. But what was clear was that the supply methods that the army had traditionally used were not only inefficient, but also prone to attack. Before Marius, armies had moved supplies through supply trains. These were large wagon convoys that carried all the supplies an army on the march could need: food, equipment, shelter to make tents, and etc. When Marius realized, he thought that if each soldier simply carried on a couple extra dozen pounds, not much when added on to the dozens of pounds of armor they were already wearing, the need for these wagons and the cost and chances of attack of these slow, cumbersome forces would be destroyed. So he rearmed and re-equipped his soldiers. They became known as Marius' mules, and they carried everything a legionary might need. They carried their tents, they carried their pots, they carried their weapons, they also carried tools made for digging and building. They had these so that they could make their own camp, which was essentially a fort, every single night, without the need of anything else. This was not the only thing that Marius did. He destroyed the class system of Roman soldiers that had been there almost since their inception. Instead, he armed and armored every single one of his legionaries in the exact same way, with state paid for arms and armor. He changed the organization of the army, he changed the terms and years of service. It was no longer conscription-based and instead a salaried professional standing force. The new armies were 20 years of active duty and 5 in reserve. The way that Marius changed the arms of the army is that he created a new class, the legionary, and destroyed all the others. This legionary was armed with 2 javelins, a metal helmet with a ceremonial crest, a plate mail jacket known as the lorica segmentata, a scutum, and a gladius. Occasionally, these soldiers still used chainmail, as plate mail was quite expensive and was still very cumbersome. Here you can see 2 of these soldiers, one of them in full marching gear and the other in battle gear with his ceremonial crest attached. Now, every soldier was armed as this, and the legion fought as an incredibly drilled and well-trained unit. In 107 BC, these reforms were solidified in law, and the manipular legion gave way to the cohort legion. The legion was the largest unit of this army, consisting of roughly 5,000 men, though the number fluctuated a few times in history. Legions contained 10 cohorts of around 480 legionaries, and cohorts were subdivided into 6 centuries of 80 men each. 10 men contumerium made up each century. The first cohort, which was the most honorable position in the legion, numbered almost 800 and held that legion's standard. A new trend appeared at this time due to the new recruitment system as well, a trend that would cause dozens of civil war in the future. This deadly trend was the legion's loyalty to the commander that paid them and got their gear, instead of to the state, which had randomly picked them in the past. This would cause Sulla's march on Rome, Caesar's march on Rome, and almost all of the power squabbles in Imperial Rome. Imperial Rome, however, did reform the army as well. Augustus, the 4th emperor, changed the number of legions to be far lower, and that number stayed between 25 and 33 for most of the history of the empire. Here you can see the typical Roman legionary. The colors used in the cloth were red, white, and blue. Red and blue were the most common, with red being the most common, but here it's blue. You can see the plate mail, known as the lorica segmentata, the gladius, and the curved shield called the scutum. But as all empires must fall, so did Rome. And as the empire became weaker and weaker, the quality of the soldiers declined. Over time, more untrained mercenaries replaced the legion, and the equipment transformed from the standardized and technologically advanced lorica segmentata and helm back to the lorica squamata, or scale mail, as seen here, or the lorica hamata, or chainmail with no helmet. Here you can see a round shield, which had only previously been used occasionally for cavalry and also in the Germanic tribes. Eventually, woolen cloths became the new armor, and pants were seen in the